A poor waitress paid for a millionaire's meal, which moved him greatly. But the next day when he arrived at work, he was shocked to find rain tapped against the window of the bus, a soft percussion that accompanied the hum of the city beyond. Laura Grant shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the weight of her suitcase pressing against her legs. The streets of New York blurred in a palette of grey and gold, a stark contrast to the sleepy town she had left behind. Her reflection in the window caught her eye, tired, uncertain, yet defiant. The bus jolted to a stop, jerking her back to reality. "Last stop," the driver called, his voice gruff but not unkind. Laura stepped out into the damp evening, the city's heartbeat pulsing around her. Horns blared, voices clashed, and somewhere nearby, a street performer's saxophone cut through the chaos like a whisper. She clutched the handle of her suitcase, her breath fogging the air. "Welcome to New York," she muttered to herself, the words tinged with a mixture of sarcasm and hope. The neon sign outside Mellis Diner buzzed faintly, its warm orange glow slicing through the grey drizzle that blanketed the city. Inside, the diner was a modest refuge from the cold, a place where the clink of forks on plates and the hum of low conversations provided a steady rhythm against the patter of rain on the windows. Laura Grant wiped her damp palms on her apron and adjusted the pencil tucked behind her ear. It wasn't much, this job, but it was enough for now, enough to keep her afloat. The city still felt overwhelming, even after 2 months. New York wasn't the romantic dream she'd imagined when she'd packed up and left her small town behind. It was loud, crowded, and relentless. And yet, it was here that she believed she could start over. Somehow. Laura moved swiftly between tables, refilling coffee cups and flashing polite smiles at the regulars. Most were middle-aged men in work jackets, women clutching oversized handbags, and the occasional tired student hunched over textbooks. They didn't care much about the girl in the slightly oversized uniform. Just another waitress blending into the backdrop. She didn't mind the anonymity. It gave her room to think about her resume tucked into her bag, the typos she was sure she'd missed, and the stack of job applications she'd sent off to companies that hadn't even replied. Her degree in communications was adequate, but in a city teeming with Ivy League graduates, adequate wasn't enough. "Laura, table 3 wants more ketchup," called Maggie, the diner's veteran waitress from behind the counter. Maggie's raspy voice carried the weight of a life spent navigating smoky diners and demanding customers. Laura grabbed the ketchup bottle and glanced at the clock. Just past 7. She hadn't even noticed the sky darkening outside. Her customers tonight were the usual mix. Exhausted cab drivers, chatty retirees, and a couple of wide-eyed tourists too polite to complain about their overcooked eggs. As she moved to the next table, the door swung open with a forceful clang, causing the tiny bell above it to jingle in protest. A man stepped inside, his presence almost immediately disrupting the routine hum of the room. He paused in the doorway, as though unsure whether to come in or walk back into the rain. He was tall, with broad shoulders that sagged slightly, his suit, what was left of its former sleekness, plastered to his frame. His dark hair stuck to his forehead, and rivulets of water dripped from his coat onto the checkered floor. Laura was struck not only by the man's bedraggled appearance, but also by the stark contrast between his tailored, expensive clothing and the disarray he was now in. He appeared disoriented, lost. Her fingers tightened briefly around the ketchup bottle before she pulled herself together. "Welcome to Mellis Diner," she said, her voice steady, despite her curiosity. "You can sit wherever you'd like." The man lifted his eyes, deep-set, stormy, and darting around the room as if he were gauging the distance to every exit. His lips parted, but he said nothing, just nodded and shuffled toward the nearest table. Maggie leaned over the counter, eyeing him with suspicion. Looks like trouble, she muttered. Laura frowned. Just looks like he's had a bad day. More like a bad year, Maggie replied, retreating to the kitchen. The man collapsed into the chair, his movements deliberate, as though each one required more energy than he could spare. He didn't take off his coat, didn't look at the menu, just sat there, staring blankly at the salt shaker in front of him. Laura hesitated before approaching. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Tea?" she asked softly, trying not to startle him. His gaze flicked up to meet hers. For a moment, there was something raw in his expression, a mix of weariness and guarded vulnerability. "Coffee?" he said finally, his voice hoarse, barely audible. Laura nodded and stepped back toward the counter, her thoughts whirring. She'd seen all sorts come through Mellis Diner: construction workers, night shift nurses, even the occasional Wall Street suit. But there was something different about this man, something unspoken, hanging heavy in the air around him. She couldn't quite place it. As she poured the coffee, her gaze drifted toward him again. He was hunched over slightly, his fingers tracing absent-minded circles on the table. Whatever his story was, it wasn't a happy one. "Here you go," she said, placing the cup gently on the table. He murmured a quiet, "Thank you," his hand brushing against hers briefly as he reached for the mug. It was cold. Laura straightened, her gaze lingering for just a moment before she turned away. Behind her, the rain outside intensified, the droplets streaking down the windows like tears. She didn't know why, but something told her this man wasn't just another customer passing through. The hot and bitter coffee contrasted sharply with the chill that enveloped Robert Hayes. He cupped the mug in both hands, willing its warmth to seep into his frozen fingers. The rain outside pounded against the glass, a relentless drumbeat that matched the ache in his temples. It had all happened so quickly. One moment, he was leaving a client dinner, the faint buzz of expensive wine still on his tongue. The next, he was on the ground, his tailored coat wet and muddy, his belongings gone. His wallet, his phone, everything he relied on to navigate the city had vanished into the night. He flexed his hands, remembering the rough tug of the bag strap as it was wrenched away. The faces of the two men who'd taken it were a blur. Their laughter, low and mocking, echoed faintly in his ears. Now, hours later, all he had was the crumpled suit on his back and a growing awareness of how fragile his carefully constructed world really was. The clatter of a plate brought him back to the present. Laura stood a few steps away, subtly watching him as she arranged silverware on a nearby table. She noticed the stiffness in his posture, the way his shoulders curved inward, as though trying to protect some unseen vulnerability. Something about him tugged at her curiosity. He didn't look like someone who frequented places like Mellis Diner, yet here he was, rain-soaked and silent. "Do you need more time with the menu?" she asked gently, though she doubted he'd even glanced at it. His head lifted, and for the first time, she caught the full weight of his eyes, stormy and restless, like they carried the weight of an ocean. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I don't have..." His voice faltered, low and gravelly. "Anything to pay with." The admission seemed to cost him something, as if he was tearing off a piece of himself to give her that sliver of truth. Laura blinked, her mind scrambling for an appropriate response. Around her, the diner buzzed with its usual rhythm. Maggie taking an order at the counter, the cook clanging pots in the back, the door jingling every so often as patrons entered and left. But here, at this table, time seemed to stretch and stall. "That's okay," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "Everyone deserves a warm meal, especially on a night like this." His brows drew together, confusion flashing across his face. "I'll pay you back," he said quickly, the edge in his tone suggesting he was grasping for dignity. She offered a small, understanding smile. "Don't worry about it. I'll just grab something for you." Without waiting for his response, she turned and made her way to the kitchen. She felt Maggie's watchful eyes as she passed the counter. "You sure about that?" Maggie asked in a low voice, leaning on her elbows. Laura nodded, brushing past her to the order window. She didn't need Maggie's approval. Something about this man, his weary face, his quiet desperation, made her decision feel right. When she returned, she placed a plate of steaming scrambled eggs, toast, and a side of bacon in front of him. The scent wafted upward, warm and comforting. "Eat," she said simply. Robert stared at the food for a moment, his hands resting on the table. Then, with a barely audible "thank you," he picked up the fork. He ate slowly, methodically, as though rationing each bite. Laura busied herself nearby, giving him space, but keeping him within her peripheral vision. She saw how his grip on the fork loosened as he finished the meal, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. When the plate was clean, he set the fork down neatly and leaned back, exhaling as though the food had lifted some invisible weight. His gaze met hers again. "Thank you," he said, this time more firmly, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. "It's no trouble," Laura replied, wiping down the counter nearby. "I'll make it up to you," he added, almost as though he needed to convince himself as much as her. "There's no need," she said, her tone light but final. "Sometimes people just need a little kindness." For a moment, he seemed to wrestle with her words, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion. He stood, adjusting his damp coat, and hesitated near the door. "I'll come back," he said, the words carrying an odd weight, as though they were both a promise and a warning. Laura watched as he stepped out into the rain, disappearing into the city night. The diner door swung shut behind him, the bell jingling softly. She lingered by the window for a moment, staring after him. It wasn't unusual for people to pass through Mellis Diner with their stories half hidden, their lives unfolding beyond the boundaries of this little place. She never asked too many questions. But this man, with his somber gaze and quiet intensity, felt different. With a small shake of her head, Laura turned back to her work. She had no way of knowing that her small act of kindness had set something in motion. Something that would soon upend her world in ways she could never have imagined. The bell above the diner door chimed faintly as Robert stepped inside. The rain still clung to his coat, though he'd traded his disheveled look for something more composed, a simple grey sweater and dark slacks. The transformation was subtle, yet deliberate, a calculated effort to blend into the hum of the small diner. Laura, balancing a tray of glasses, glanced up and caught his eye. Recognition flashed across her face, and she offered a polite smile, though her surprise was evident. "Back so soon?" He hesitated for a moment before finding his voice. "The coffee was good," he said with a faint smile, his tone casual but his posture tense. "And I thought I'd return the favor." Laura tilted her head, slightly curious. "The favor?" "I brought cash this time," he clarified, tapping his pocket lightly. She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "It's not about the money. But I appreciate the gesture. Have a seat. I'll be right with you." Robert chose a booth near the window, the same one from the other night. As he sat down, he took in the warmth of the space, the hum of conversation, the comforting smell of frying bacon, the distant laughter from the kitchen. The atmosphere was far from the polished sterility of the places he usually frequented. Laura approached moments later, notepad in hand. "So, what can I get you today? Coffee again?" "Sure," he said. "And, whatever you think is good here." She raised an eyebrow. "Trust in a stranger with your meal choice?" Bold move. "I like to take risks," he replied, the faintest hint of amusement in his voice. Laura smirked, scribbling quickly on her pad before walking away. When she returned with his coffee, she lingered for a moment. "You're not from around here, are you?" "Is it that obvious?" "A little," she admitted, leaning slightly against the booth. "You don't look like someone who grew up around the corner." He sipped his coffee, the steam curling upward as he spoke. "I moved here for work. Needed a change of scenery. What do you do?" "I'm in an office," he said vaguely, letting the lie slide out smoothly. "Paperwork, meetings, the usual grind." Laura nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. "Well, welcome to the city. It's an adjustment. You've been here long?" 2 months, she said, her voice softening. "It's not exactly how I pictured it, but I'm making it work." He studied her, noticing how her smile dimmed just slightly. "What brought you here?" Laura hesitated, then shrugged. "I wanted more than what my town could offer. I have a degree, but nothing fancy. I thought I could find an office job here, but it's harder than I expected. For now, this job keeps the lights on." There was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet determination that Robert found striking. "You'll get there," he said simply, his voice steady. She blinked, taken aback by his assurance. "I hope so. What about you? Adjusting well?" "Let's just say New York has a way of keeping you on your toes," he said, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. Laura laughed lightly. "That's one way to put it. Well, let me get your food. Don't go anywhere." He watched her retreat to the counter, her steps purposeful, her movements efficient. There was something magnetic about her, an unassuming grace that drew people in without effort. She didn't try to impress, didn't posture or perform. She just was. When she returned with his plate, she set it down and slid into the booth across from him, surprising both of them. "I figured I'd sit for a minute. It's slow right now, and Maggie's got things under control." "Good call," Robert said, lifting his fork. "I'll let you know if you made the right choice with the food." She grinned, leaning back. "Go ahead. I'll take the criticism." He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully before nodding. "Not bad. Not bad," she teased. "I thought you liked to take risks." "I've had worse," he deadpanned, though the twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed his amusement. The conversation naturally flowed as they settled into a comfortable rhythm. Laura talked about her hometown, her love for books, and her dreams of one day working in public relations. She didn't embellish or dramatize, but her words carried an earnestness that made Robert want to listen. In turn, he shared carefully curated pieces of himself, the less glamorous, more relatable fragments of his life. He spoke of long days at a desk, the pressure of deadlines, and the small joys of finding moments of quiet in the chaos of the city. For a while, the rain outside faded into the background, the diner shrinking into a pocket of calm amidst the bustling world. When their conversation wound down, Laura stood, smoothing her apron. "You should come back sometime. We're here almost every day." "I just might," Robert replied, meaning it more than she realized. As she walked away, he realized her words had left an imprint, a quiet invitation that felt heavier than it sounded. And so, Robert made a silent decision. He would return again and again, not just for the coffee, but for the woman who had shown him kindness without knowing who he truly was. The streets were quieter than usual, the kind of eerie silence that made every footstep sound louder. Laura clutched her coat tightly around herself as she hurried home. her breath forming faint clouds in the cold night air. Mellis Diner had been busy, and cleaning up afterward had stretched her shift far later than expected. Turning down a narrow street, she felt it, a presence behind her. The man had been following her for a block, his steps uncomfortably close. Her heartbeat quickened. "Hey, sweetheart," a slurred voice called. She didn't stop, didn't turn. The man quickened his pace, closing the distance. "Don't ignore me. I'm talking to you." Her grip on her bag tightened as she darted her eyes around, searching for an escape. The streetlights flickered, casting long, wavering shadows. "Come on, don't be shy," he said, his tone shifting from coaxing to menacing. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "There you are, babe. I've been looking everywhere. For you." Laura froze, her head snapping toward the sound. Robert. He strode toward her with the kind of calm confidence that commanded attention. His tie was slightly loosened, his suit wrinkled from what must have been a long day, but his expression was steady and purposeful. The late-night meeting with the partner just ended a few minutes ago. He is also on his way home, and then saw Laura and a suspicious guy who didn't look like a good guy. Robert slipped an arm around Laura's shoulders, pulling her gently but firmly into his side. His voice softened, almost playful. "You didn't answer your phone." "I was worried." The man hesitated, his bravado faltering. "I didn't know she was—" "She's mine," Robert interrupted, his tone cool and pointed. The man muttered something under his breath before slinking away into the night. Laura exhaled shakily, realizing she'd been holding her breath. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above a whisper. "Are you okay?" Robert asked, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of distress. "I am now," she replied, offering a small, grateful smile. "Let me walk you home," he said, firmly. They walked in silence, the tension slowly easing as the city's distant hum filled the space between them. When they reached her apartment, Robert hesitated. "You'll be safe from here?" She nodded, her smile warmer now. "I will. Thanks to you." "Any time," he said softly, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned to leave. As Laura watched him disappear into the night, a flicker of something new stirred in her chest. Whatever this connection was, it was growing stronger. Laura sat cross-legged on her small couch, the hum of the city filtering through her drafty apartment windows. Laura's laptop perched precariously on her knees, glowing faintly in the room's dim light. The cursor flickered on the screen, lingering over an employment opportunity that appeared too promising to be genuine. Hayes Industries, Public Relations Assistant. Hayes Industries, Public Relations Assistant. She read through the description again, her heart racing. It sounded perfect. Challenging, yes, but aligned with her long-held dream of working in public relations. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, doubt creeping in. "What's the worst that could happen?" she muttered to herself, inhaling deeply. With a few decisive clicks, she uploaded her resume and hit submit. The weight of the moment settled over her as she closed the laptop. For the first time in weeks, she gave herself a glimpse of hope. The next day, her phone buzzed while she was folding napkins at the diner. She glanced at the screen and froze. She whispered to herself, her heart racing. Wiping her hands quickly on her apron, she stepped into the back room and answered. "This is Laura Grant," she said, trying to sound composed. "Hi, Ms. Grant. This is Claire from Hayes Industries. We've reviewed your application and we'd like to invite you for an interview tomorrow morning." Laura's stomach flipped. "Thank you so much." "I'll be there," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. As she ended the call, a grin spread across her face, too big to contain. She glanced at her reflection in the streaked mirror of the break room, whispering, "You've got this." The bell above the diner door chimed faintly as Robert stepped inside. The damp chill of the city clung to him, though his appearance was noticeably different tonight. A simple grey sweater replaced the tailored suits, and dark slacks gave him an understated, almost casual air. He scanned the room, his gaze softening when it landed on Laura behind the counter, her auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She looked up from wiping the counter and smiled, brighter than usual, as though a small secret had found its way into her day. "Back again?" "The coffee's good," Robert replied, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "And I thought I'd see if the company is as good the second time around." Laura chuckled as she approached. There was something lighter about her tonight, though she didn't explain it. "Well, in that case, grab a seat. I'll be right there." Robert chose his usual booth near the window. He watched her move, her steps brisk but fluid, her attention constantly shifting between customers. Tonight, however, there was an extra spring in her step. When she finally came over with a steaming mug of coffee, Robert tilted his head slightly. "You seem happy." Laura glanced down, biting back a grin as she poured cream into the cup. "Do I?" "Yes. And I don't think it's the thrill of diner work." She laughed softly, the sound light and genuine. "Let's just say it's been a good day." "Care to share what made it good?" She hesitated, twirling her pen between her fingers. "Not yet. Maybe when I know how it turns out." That cryptic response piqued his curiosity, but Robert chose not to press further. "Fair enough," he said, leaning back in his seat. "I'll just have to wait then." She gave him a sly smile, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "Patience suits you." They talked easily after that, their conversation flowing from casual observations about the city to light-hearted jokes. When Laura's shift ended, Robert offered to walk her to the bus stop. "It's really fine," she said, slipping on her coat. "I insist," Robert replied, his tone leaving no room for debate. "It's dark, and I'd rather not have you walking alone." The night air was crisp as they stepped outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glossy under the dim glow of streetlights. They walked side by side, their pace unhurried. "So," Robert began, breaking the companionable silence, "are you always this secretive about good days?" Laura smiled faintly, her gaze fixed ahead. "Sometimes it feels safer to wait before sharing something, in case it doesn't work out." Robert noted the spark in her eyes, the determination in her voice as she spoke about her day. He didn't press her for more details, content to enjoy the moment. The next morning, Laura called Maggie to request the day off. "Big plans?" Maggie asked, suspicion lacing her tone. "Just something personal," Laura replied vaguely, her nerves mounting as she hung up. At the diner, Robert arrived at his usual time, the faintest flicker of anticipation in his chest. But when he scanned the room, Laura was nowhere to be seen. "She's not here today," Maggie said, noticing his puzzled expression. "Called in." "Oh," was all Robert managed, masking his disappointment. He ordered a coffee and sat at his usual booth, his mind wandering. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the streets remained damp, reflecting the city's relentless pace. Robert sipped his coffee, his thoughts lingering on Laura's absence, unaware of the events that were quietly shifting the trajectory of their lives. Robert stepped out of the elevator onto the sleek, marble-floored 6th floor of Hayes Industries, his polished shoes clicking softly with each step. The hum of activity surrounded him. Assistants moving between offices, the murmur of conference calls, and the occasional beep of phones. His day had been filled with meetings, but a lingering thought about Laura's absence kept pulling at the edges of his mind. He walked down the hall, flipping through a report, when the door to the interview room swung open ahead of him. A familiar voice, imbued with nervous excitement, abruptly halted him. "Thank you so much for your time," Laura said, stepping out with a polite nod toward a woman in a sharp suit. Robert froze, the folder in his hands momentarily forgotten. His gaze locked on Laura, who stood in the same hallway, clutching a folder of her own. She looked different, not the waitress from Mellis Diner, but someone polished, hopeful, and determined. The moment stretched unbearably long before Laura turned and saw him. Her smile faltered as her eyes widened. "Robert?" she breathed, confusion flickering across her face. "Laura," he said, recovering just enough to sound composed, but his heart was racing. Before he could say more, Claire appeared beside him, holding a tablet. "Mr. Hayes, we need to discuss—" She stopped abruptly when she saw Laura. "Oh, I see. You've met one of the applicants." Laura's face drained of color. "Mr. Hayes?" Claire glanced between them, puzzled, before realization dawned. "Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. Robert Hayes is our CEO." The words echoed through the air, akin to a thunderclap. Laura took a step back, her expression shifting from confusion to hurt. "You're—" she began, her voice shaking slightly. "Laura, I can explain," Robert said quickly, stepping forward, but she shook her head. "You lied," she whispered, clutching her folder tightly to her chest. "It's not what you think," he said, his tone urgent, but Laura's eyes were already glistening with a mixture of anger and betrayal. "I thought—" She paused, her voice breaking. "I thought I knew you." Before he could respond, Laura turned and hurried down the hall. Robert moved to follow her, but Claire placed a hand on his arm. "Sir, you have a meeting in 5 minutes," she said softly, her tone cautious. He hesitated, his instincts conflicting with his responsibilities. Ultimately, he released her, despite a deep-seated conviction that he was making a mistake. Outside the building, Laura's breath hitched as she stepped onto the bustling sidewalk. Her chest tightened, the weight of humiliation and betrayal pressing down on her. She replayed their conversations in her mind, his vague answers about his work, the way he listened to her dreams, his unassuming presence at the diner. It had all felt so real, so genuine, but now it seemed like a lie, a cruel trick. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't let herself fall apart, not here, not now. Her phone buzzed in her bag. She ignored it, walking faster, the noise of the city, a welcome distraction from the turmoil inside her. Robert felt the day drag on, like a burden around his neck. The memory of Laura's devastated expression replayed endlessly in his mind. He'd come to Hayes Industries to work, to lead, but now the very building felt suffocating, like it had swallowed something precious. He leaned back in his office chair, staring out at the city skyline. "How do I fix this?" he muttered to himself, knowing full well that no simple answer existed. Did you hear this story when the sun was high or low? If it was still light, comment matcha, and if it was dark, comment chocolate. That evening, Laura sat alone in her apartment, the soft hum of the city filtering through her drafty windows. She stared at the job offer email from Hayes Industries, the screen's glow cutting through the dim room. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, her mind torn between accepting the opportunity she'd worked so hard for and the overwhelming urge to cut ties with anything connected to Robert Hayes. She didn't delete the email, but she didn't respond either. Instead, she closed her laptop and curled up on the couch, the city lights casting fractured patterns on the walls as the weight of the day pressed down on her. Somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that this wasn't the end of the story. But she couldn't bring herself to believe it just yet. The faint knock on Laura's apartment door startled her. She sat up on the couch, the quiet hum of the city filtering through her open window. It was late, and she wasn't expecting anyone. "Laura, it's Robert." Her heart sank at the sound of his voice. For a moment she froze, debating whether to answer. "Please," he continued, his voice muffled through the door. "I need to explain." Her hands clenched into fists, nails pressing into her palms. She approached the door, but stopped just short of opening it. "You've already said enough, Robert." "Laura, I didn't mean to deceive you," he said, his tone earnest. "I never intended for you to find out this way." She leaned her forehead against the door, the cool wood grounding her as anger bubbled beneath the surface. "You should have been honest from the start," she said, her voice trembling. "Instead, you let me believe. I don't even know what to think anymore." There was a long pause. "You're right," he said finally, his voice softer now. "But you have to know that my feelings, my respect for you, have always been genuine. I didn't tell you because I didn't want this wall between us." Laura closed her eyes, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. "There's already a wall, Robert. You built it the moment you lied to me." She stepped back from the door, her chest tightening as she heard his quiet sigh. "I'm sorry," he said, the weight in his voice unmistakable. "More than I can say." The silence that followed was heavy. After a moment, she heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway. Laura sat cross-legged on the couch, staring at the untouched cup of tea on the coffee table. The room felt unbearably quiet, her thoughts louder than any city noise outside. She replayed the conversation in her mind, the tentative trust they'd built, now fractured by his dishonesty. Her gaze shifted to the laptop on the table. The job offer from Hayes Industries sat in her inbox, the subject line bold against the rest of her unread messages. It was everything she'd wanted: stability, a chance to prove herself, a step toward her dreams. But the name Hayes Industries felt like a weight now, tied irrevocably to Robert and the tangled mess of emotions he'd stirred in her. She buried her face in her hands, torn between resentment and the faintest thread of hope. 3 days passed before Laura heard anything more. The sting of Robert's deception dulled, but didn't disappear, lingering like a bruise she couldn't ignore. She went about her shifts at the diner, trying to push the job offer, and Robert out of her mind. Late in the afternoon, a knock on her door startled her. She opened it to find a poised professional woman standing there. "Miss Grant?" the woman asked, smiling politely. "Yes?" "I'm Claire, from Hayes Industries. I'm here to deliver something for you." Laura blinked as Claire handed her an envelope. Inside was a letter formally offering her the 6-month internship, signed by the HR manager. "Mr. Hayes wanted me to clarify that this decision was based entirely on your application and interview performance," Claire said, her voice calm and professional. "He hasn't interfered in the hiring process." Laura's brow furrowed. "Why? Why are you telling me this?" Claire's smile softened, as though she understood the unspoken turmoil behind Laura's question. "He thought you might question whether this opportunity was truly yours. I can assure you, it is." Laura stood there, the envelope clutched in her hands as Claire gave her a polite nod and turned to leave. That evening, Laura sat at her tiny kitchen table, staring at the letter. The words blurred as her emotions warred within her. She thought of Robert showing up at her door, of the hurt in his voice as he tried to explain. But most of all, she thought of her dreams. This job was everything she'd worked for, her chance to prove herself, to build something she could be proud of. The decision sat heavy on her shoulders, but as she picked up her pen to sign the acceptance form, she realized something. Whatever her feelings about Robert, this was her moment, and she wouldn't let anyone take it from her. With a deep breath, Laura signed her name. The elevator ride to the 14th floor of Hayes Industries felt endless. Laura clutched her bag tightly, her nerves fraying with every passing second. When the elevator doors finally slid open, she stepped into the brightly lit office space, where polished glass walls and sleek furniture gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Colleagues bustled around, dressed in sharp suits and tailored dresses. Their conversations were clipped and purposeful, their strides brisk. Laura adjusted her blazer, feeling suddenly out of place in her carefully chosen but modest outfit. "Miss Grant?" Laura turned to see Janet, the HR manager, smiling at her warmly. "Welcome to Hayes Industries. I'll show you to your desk and give you a quick tour." Laura followed Janet, trying to absorb everything as they weaved through the maze of cubicles. The office was a stark contrast to the cozy chaos of Mellis Diner, making Laura feel like an outsider in this polished world. "You'll be working closely with the PR team," Janet explained, stopping at a small but functional desk near the windows. "I'm confident you'll do great." "Thank you," Laura said, her voice steady despite the knots in her stomach. The morning passed in a blur of introductions and onboarding tasks. Laura focused on her work, but the polished confidence of her colleagues loomed like a shadow over her desk. She couldn't shake the feeling that everyone around her was more experienced, more polished, more everything. By lunchtime, Laura decided to step outside to clear her head. As she exited the building, the familiar scent of coffee and sizzling bacon drifted toward her. Without thinking, she found herself heading to Mellis Diner. The bell jingled as Laura pushed open the door. The warmth of the diner enveloped her instantly, and she sighed in relief. Maggie spotted her and waved from behind the counter. "Don't tell me you're already sick of that fancy office," Maggie teased. "Not yet," Laura replied, smiling. "Just needed a breather." As she slid into a booth, the door jingled again. Laura turned to see Robert stepping inside, his presence both familiar and unexpected. "Laura," he said, his surprise quickly morphing into a smile. She nodded, feeling the tension from the past week flare briefly before ebbing. "Hi." Robert hesitated for a moment, then gestured to the seat across from her. "Mind if I join you?" She shrugged, keeping her tone neutral. "Sure." As they waited for their orders, their conversation drifted into safer territory. They reminisced about their first meeting at the diner, the easy rhythm of their banter slowly returning. "You've come a long way," Robert said, his voice low but sincere. Laura glanced at him, unsure how to respond. Before she could speak, the door jingled again. A sharp-eyed woman from the office, someone Laura vaguely recognized from HR, stepped inside. Her gaze landed on Laura and Robert, her expression shifting from curiosity to something sharper. Laura tensed, but Robert didn't seem to notice. The next morning, Laura entered the office to find a strange energy in the air. People exchanged glances as she walked by, their conversations dropping to whispers. By mid-morning, the rumors reached her. "Did you hear about the new intern?" a voice whispered nearby. "Apparently she's close with Mr. Hayes." "I heard they were having lunch together yesterday," another voice added. "Explains how she got hired," someone muttered. Laura's cheeks burned as the words reached her ears. She kept her head down, focusing on her work, but the weight of the whispers settled heavily on her shoulders. In his office, Robert leaned back in his chair, staring at his desk. Claire had informed him of the rumors circulating about Laura. Claire expressed that the situation is escalating beyond control. "Speculations about favoritism are circulating," Robert frowned. He wanted to shut the rumors down immediately, but he hesitated. He didn't want to interfere too directly, knowing it might only fuel the gossip. Despite the bitter taste in his mouth, he finally said, "Let it settle for now." By the end of the day, Laura felt drained. As she packed up her things, Robert appeared at her desk. "Can we talk?" he asked. She hesitated before nodding. They walked to the lobby where the city lights flickered beyond the glass doors. "I heard about the rumors," Robert said, his tone careful. Laura crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "I didn't ask for any of this." "I know," he said quickly, "and I'll ensure it doesn't spiral out of control." "Maybe you should have thought about that before joining me at the diner," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Robert winced but nodded. "You're right. I wanted to make sure you were okay." Her shoulders sagged slightly. "I don't need your protection, Robert. I need to prove I deserve to be here." "You do deserve to be here," he said firmly. "Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Laura held his gaze for a moment before nodding. "Thank you." As they parted ways, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that her path at Hayes Industries was going to be more complicated than she'd anticipated. Laura stepped into the office the next morning, with her chin held high, but her resolve wavered as she still overheard snippets of whispered conversations. "I heard she got hired because of him." "Did you see them at lunch? So cozy." "She's not even that impressive. Must be nice to have connections." Her steps slowed as the words seeped in, cutting deeper with each repetition. She ducked into the break room, her chest tight. Leaning against the counter, she tried to steady her breath, but the voices followed her like shadows. The pivotal moment occurred during a team meeting later that afternoon. Laura was presenting her ideas for an upcoming PR campaign when one of her colleagues, a sharp-featured woman named Ellen, interrupted. "Interesting ideas," Ellen said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But I wonder if these came from your own experience or someone else's influence." The room fell silent, the tension crackling like static electricity. Laura's face burned, but she forced herself to meet Ellen's gaze. "I assure you, they're my own," she said evenly, though her voice trembled slightly. The meeting continued, but Laura's confidence was shattered. She finished her part quickly and sank into her chair, wishing she could disappear. Robert heard about the incident from Claire later that day. "This has gone too far," Claire said firmly. "You need to address it, or it'll only get worse." He nodded, his jaw tight. He had hoped that the rumors would subside naturally, but it was now evident that his silence had only intensified the situation. The following morning, Robert called an all-hands meeting. The large conference room filled quickly, murmurs of curiosity buzzing through the air. Laura sat near the back, her hands clenched in her lap, unsure of what to expect. Robert entered the room with his usual commanding presence, but there was an uncharacteristic tension in his expression. He stood at the head of the table, scanning the room before speaking. "I've heard the rumors," he began, his voice steady but firm, "and I'm addressing them now because they undermine not only one of our team members, but also the integrity of this company." The room fell silent, all eyes on him. "I met Laura Grant outside of this office, yes," he continued. "But let me make one thing very clear. Her position here was earned entirely on her own merits. She applied through the same process as everyone else and was selected because of her qualifications and potential." His gaze swept across the room, lingering on a few individuals who had been particularly vocal. The insinuations being made are not only false, but damaging. Hayes Industries does not tolerate this kind of behavior. The weight of his words hung in the air. Laura's chest tightened as a mixture of relief and gratitude washed over her. After the meeting, Robert found Laura at her desk. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice laced with emotion. He nodded. "You don't have to thank me. You deserved the truth to be told." "I wasn't sure if you'd say anything," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I had to," he said, his tone softening. You deserve a fair chance to succeed here, and I won't let anyone take that from you." That evening, as Laura sat at her small kitchen table, she reflected on the events of the day. Robert's defense had reignited something in her, a determination to prove herself, not just to others, but to herself as well. The whispers and doubts hadn't disappeared, but they no longer felt insurmountable. She picked up her notebook and began sketching out ideas for the next campaign, her resolve strengthening with each word. This was her opportunity, and she wouldn't let anything or anyone diminish it. The air between Laura and Robert shifted after his public defense of her at the company meeting. Though she still felt the weight of whispers and sidelong glances, her conversations with Robert became more natural and unguarded. She gradually lowered her barriers once more. One evening a few weeks later, Laura stayed late at the office to finalize a campaign presentation. The quiet hum of the nearly empty building felt strangely comforting. As she packed up her things, she heard footsteps approaching. "Still here?" Robert's familiar voice broke the silence. Laura looked up, startled but not displeased. "Just wrapping up. What about you?" He shrugged, loosening his tie. "Late meetings? It seems to be a theme for me." She laughed softly, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "Well, you should learn to delegate better, Mr. Hayes." He smirked at her teasing. "I'll take that under advisement. Hungry?" Laura hesitated, taken aback by the question. "I could eat, I guess." "There's a place I've been meaning to revisit," Robert said casually. "Care to join me?" The bell above the door of MILLIONAIRE'S diner jingled as they stepped inside, the warm, familiar scent of coffee and frying bacon enveloping them. Laura's chest tightened as memories flooded back. "Did you plan this?" she asked, glancing at Robert. "Not exactly," he admitted, holding the door open for her. "But it felt right." They slid into the same booth they'd shared during their first few conversations. Maggie spotted them from behind the counter and raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment, offering only a knowing smile. The conversation flowed effortlessly as they waited for their food, just as it had in the diner's comfortable surroundings. They reminisced about their first encounter. Laura's kindness, Robert's disheveled state, and the way their lives had inexplicably intertwined since. "You looked so out of place that night," Laura teased, stirring her coffee. "Like a lost rich guy who'd never seen a diner before." Robert chuckled, leaning back in his seat. "You weren't wrong. I experienced a sense of dislocation, but you made it less so." Her cheeks flushed slightly, and she looked down at her cup. "I suppose I've always had a fondness for assisting others." "Well, you certainly helped me," he said, his voice softening. "More than you know." The moment hung between them, charged but unspoken. As they finished their meal, Maggie brought over the check and lingered for a moment. "Nice to see you two back here," she said, her tone playful but kind. "Nice to be back," Laura replied with a small smile. Robert paid the bill without hesitation, ignoring Laura's protests. "Consider it my turn to return the favor," he said with a grin. As they stepped outside, the cool evening air brushed against them. They walked side by side, their steps unhurried. The city's noise buzzed around them, but it felt distant, almost muted. "Thanks for tonight," Laura said after a while. "I didn't realize how much I missed that place." "Neither did I," Robert admitted. He glanced at her, his gaze lingering. "Sometimes it's good to go back to where things started." She met his eyes, something warm flickering between them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she laughed softly, breaking the tension. "You're starting to sound like a Hallmark card," he smirked. "Maybe you're rubbing off on me." They reached her apartment building, and Robert stopped at the steps. "Get some rest," he said, his voice low but warm. "You too," she replied, pausing before heading inside. And thanks again. For everything. Robert nodded, watching as she disappeared through the door. That night, Laura lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts drifted to the easy conversation, the shared laughter, and the way Robert's eyes had lingered on hers just a little longer than necessary. It wasn't just trust they were rebuilding. Something else was beginning to take root, a quiet, fragile affection that neither of them had acknowledged outright, but both could feel. And for the first time in weeks, Laura didn't feel alone. The office buzzed with its usual energy, but for Laura, the atmosphere felt heavier. The PR campaign she had been assigned was the most challenging task she'd ever faced. It was ambitious, layered with tight deadlines, and brimming with expectations from her team, most of whom had doubted her since day one. Laura threw herself into the project with determination. Late nights became her routine, and her desk was perpetually cluttered with drafts, notes, and coffee cups. Despite her insecurities gnawing at her, she refused to give in. 2 weeks later, the campaign launched. The results were immediate and resounding. Client feedback poured in with glowing praise for the creativity and strategy behind the campaign. Even the once skeptical Ellen couldn't hide her approval during the morning meeting. "That was impressive, Laura," Ellen admitted reluctantly. Laura nodded, suppressing a smile. The sense of accomplishment that bloomed in her chest felt hard-earned and deeply satisfying. For the first time, the whispers and glances from her colleagues weren't filled with judgment. They were laced with respect. That evening, Laura stayed late to finish the last of the campaign documentation. The office was quiet, her only company the faint hum of the city outside the windows. "Still working?" Robert's voice startled her. Laura looked up to find him leaning against the doorframe of her office, his tie slightly loosened. "Just wrapping up," she replied, setting down her pen. "You?" "Same," he said, stepping into the room. He gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "Mind if I sit?" "Not at all," she said, leaning back in her chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Robert's gaze swept across her desk, taking in the scattered papers and empty coffee cups. "You did well on the campaign," he said finally. "The results are outstanding." "Thank you," Laura said, her voice steady. He hesitated before continuing, his tone softer now. "I knew you could do it, Laura. I just wish you knew it too." She was taken aback by the vulnerability in his words. She studied him, noticing the faint lines of exhaustion on his face, the way his shoulders seemed less rigid than usual. "You seem tired," she said quietly. Robert gave a small laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Tired doesn't begin to cover it." "Long day?" "Long life," he said with a wry smile. Then, after a pause, he added, "I've been thinking a lot lately, about how much time I spend chasing things that don't really matter." Laura tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What brought that on?" He hesitated, then looked at her directly. "You." Her breath caught, but she didn't interrupt. "You remind me of the things I've forgotten," he said, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. Kindness, resilience, connection. I've spent so much time building walls, trying to protect myself, that I didn't realize how lonely it's made me. "Robert," she began, but he held up a hand, his expression soft. "I just want you to know that you've changed the way I see things, the way I see myself, and I'm grateful for that." The room felt heavy with unspoken words, the air charged with an intensity Laura couldn't quite name. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." He nodded, his gaze lingering on hers. "You deserve everything you've worked for, Laura. Don't ever doubt that." Later that night, as Laura walked home, Robert's words echoed in her mind. She replayed the look in his eyes, the weight of his confession, and the way it had made her feel, seen, valued, and something more she wasn't ready to name. In her tiny apartment, she sat at her desk, her campaign notes still scattered across the surface. But her focus wasn't on work. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of what was growing between her and Robert. It wasn't just trust. It wasn't just respect. It was something far deeper, and it scared her as much as it exhilarated her. Laura's 6-month internship at Hayes Industries was filled with challenges, growth, and self-discovery. She had fought hard to prove herself, delivering projects that exceeded expectations and silenced her skeptics. When Janet from HR called her into a meeting, at the end of her internship, Laura braced herself, her heart pounding. "Laura," Janet began, smiling warmly, "it's my pleasure to offer you a full-time position here at Hayes Industries. Your work has been exceptional, and we're excited to see where you'll go next with us." Relief and pride surged through Laura as she nodded, her voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to spill over. "Thank you so much. This means so much to me." That evening, Laura found herself back at Mellis' diner, waiting for Robert. He had invited her to dinner to celebrate her success, though he had remained unusually vague about the details. When he arrived, dressed in a tailored navy suit but looking more relaxed than usual, Laura smiled. "You didn't have to make such a big deal out of this." "It's not every day you get offered your dream job," he replied, pulling out a chair for her. As they shared a meal, their conversation felt lighter than it had in months. Laura teased Robert about his seriousness at work, while he recounted a disastrous first meeting he'd had with a high-profile client years ago. But beneath the laughter, a quiet understanding simmered between them. A recognition of everything they had been through to reach this point. A few days later, Robert asked Laura to meet him on the rooftop of Hayes Industries after work. She was puzzled but curious, her steps echoing softly as she climbed the final stairs to the open air. The city stretched out before her, glittering under the night sky. Robert stood near the edge, his hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. "This is breathtaking," Laura said as she approached, the cool breeze tugging at her hair. "It is," Robert agreed, though his eyes were on her rather than the skyline. They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the city below filling the space between them. "Laura," Robert began, his tone unusually serious. She turned to him, her brows furrowing slightly. "What is it?" "I've been thinking a lot about everything we've been through. The challenges, the misunderstandings, the way you've shown me what it means to connect with someone genuinely." He paused, his gaze steady. "You've changed my life in ways I didn't think were possible." Her breath hitched as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. "Robert," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He opened the box, revealing a delicate diamond ring. "Laura Grant, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Not because of how you've changed me, but because of who you are. Strong, kind, resilient. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Laura's eyes as she looked at him, her heart full. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then, with a radiant smile, she said, "Yes." Robert slipped the ring onto her finger, his own smile breaking through the tension he hadn't realized he was holding. Later, as they walked hand in hand through the bustling streets of New York, Laura felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. The city moved around them, alive with energy and possibility. But for Laura and Robert, it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them, their future stretching out like the glittering lights above. And for the first time, Laura felt truly at home, not just in the city, but in the life they were building together. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.